All right, it's 12:30, so I'll call to order the Green Mountain Care Board's meeting of July 14th, 2023. We rescheduled this meeting from this Wednesday due to the flood, so thanks for waiting. Some of our staff and board members have had some displacement and are dealing with that, and looks like we may have lost our building. At least temporarily anyway. And so I wanted to thank everyone at the Care Board for helping each other out, and Kristen Lajeunesse for scrambling to find me a place to do the hearing. We've also heard about some challenges that many others have had, including Johnson Health Center, Jenna's Promise, and Copley Hospital. And so I just wanted to express our thoughts with all those folks, and the challenges are real. We've had a lot of people ask me here at the board about volunteering to help, as have a lot of people across the state. And so a huge acknowledgement for all those folks who are helping their community and their coworkers, and those trying to provide care and help everyone. So a tough week, but it's great to see that a lot of people are trying to make efforts to help their community, given the realities of the blow our beautiful state has taken this week. We are without our executive director Barrett today, so I'll highlight a couple things before we get into the meat of the meeting today. The first is public comments for rate review. Those started on May 9th, and they'll continue until July 24th. And folks can submit comments via the Green Mountain Care Board public comment page or the Healthcare Advocates website. We have two upcoming rate review hearings. On Monday, July 9th, starting at 8 a.m., we have a hearing on the rates that have been submitted. And then on Wednesday, July 19th, so the 17th and 19th, Monday and Wednesday of next week, both starting at 8 a.m. We also have additional public comment forum that we will host on Monday, July 24th at 4:30 p.m. And we have one agenda item today, and that's the OneCare Vermont fiscal year 24 budget guidance, which our health policy project director, Michelle Sawyer, and staff attorney Russ McCracken will present. And before I turn it over to them, we'll turn to approval of the minutes from June 28th, 2023. Is there a motion to approve those minutes?
I'll move approval.
Second.
I'll second.
Any board discussion? And all those in favor, please say aye.
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 Aye. And the minutes are unanimously approved. I received an update this morning from Ms. Sawyer, Mr. McCracken, and I think we're going to focus the discussion on OneCare's budget guidance to the non-executive compensation issues. And it sounds like we're still waiting for a couple pieces of information in response to our requests. And once we get those, or we have the information we need, we'll go back to that issue. So for now, I'll turn it over to Ms. Sawyer and Mr. McCracken.
Thank you, Chair Foster. And thank you, Julia, for driving the slides today. All right, you can go to the next slide, please. So the agenda for today, we'll review the public comment received on the certified ACO budget guidance. We will review some proposed changes that have occurred since the last time we looked at this guidance. We'll touch on the executive compensation benchmarking just briefly, and then we'll get into motion options. Next slide, please. I also wanted to sneak in a timeline here. So obviously we have not yet issued the ACO budget guidance. Generally, we try to do that by July 1st of each year, but due to the subpoena, that has been delayed, but we have a potential vote slated for this meeting, so that may happen. And then it is expected that OneCare will submit their budget to us October 2nd. In the fall, there will be a hearing in November, a staff presentation as well. And the vote will, the Green Mountain Care Board will vote on the budget in December prior to the start of the fiscal year. Next slide, please. We received public comments from 5 different parties. Thank you all to thank you to all of you who submitted public comments. We really appreciate your contributions and your thoughts. The topics generally covered the data analytics transition. They covered the executive compensation. That some were around the subpoena itself, and others discussed the number of attributed lives served compared to the OneCare's budget. Next slide, please. So these are the proposed changes to the guidance since the last time the staff presented. The workbook will start there. So tab 6.7, and I'll stop and say all of this is publicly available on our website should anybody like to see what these changes encompass. We added in a few additional columns to collect salary benchmark data for each of the executive positions. And then we just made several technical edits as well to that workbook. The narrative portion of the guidance, we started with part 1, the ACO budget targets. We made an edit to the budget target instructions to give some context around the purpose that these serve. And I'd like to speak to that now. This year, this section of the guidance has been expanded significantly. So it's important that we understand what these targets are and what they are not. The intent of budget targets is to signal to the ACO as it's creating its budget for the following year what the Green Mountain Care Board would like to see. The targets are indicators to be used by OneCare in developing and preparing its proposed budget. It is the hope that this will improve the clarity of the board's priorities and reduce the amount of modification necessary to the ACO's budget after their submission. As the note on the slide says, there is no penalty if the ACO does not meet a budget target. However, they will be expected to justify why they did not meet it. The targets will assist the board in determining whether to approve or modify OneCare's proposed budget. If a budget target is met, the ACO can expect less scrutiny on that particular area of their budget. So a target, in other words, is not a mandate or binding like a budget order would be. No matter what the ACO submits in their budget, it can be modified by the board through a budget order, and the inclusion of budget targets or whether or not an ACO meets those targets does not impact the board's ability to modify the budget. All right, so then also a technical change was made with the language in many of the budget targets. We just changed the language from shall to must, as shall is legally more appropriate for an order. Next slide, please. Additional edits to budget targets. Number 2, we removed the Medicare FPP target, recognizing that it's not within the ACO's ability to influence the achievement of that target at this time. For budget target number 5, we clarified the definition of PHM, payment reform payments, to be inclusive of FPP and bonus payments. Budget target number 7 is the one which links variable compensation to the achievement of quality and cost metrics. And we added language there saying that at least one metric should tie back to the benchmarking report. And in number 8, we added a target for the ACO to submit a plan to the board describing how it plans to increase provider accountability for quality performance. So that wraps up the changes to the budget targets. The next section is the reporting requirements. We added a sub-question in section 5, which is the risk model section. There was a question asking the ACO to discuss program goals, strategies, opportunities, and limitations for the following. There was a list of items there, and we added one to improving access to behavioral health services. Next slide, please. In section 6, which is the budget section, the financial section, we've made an addition to question 7. We're looking for an explanation of how the ACO determines that outsourced services are at fair market value. Also in this section, we added a question around administrative expenses. Describe the administrative expenses incurred in connection with implementing each of the population and payment reform programs, as well as data and analytics work. We added another sub-question in section 6 around executive compensation. For each position, explain how salary benchmarks were determined and utilized when budgeting the base and total executive compensation. Justification for executive compensation shall include reference to and analysis of the ACO's performance. In section 7, which is the population health section, we added question 4, a description of the impact of each population health program on containing costs, improving access to care, and/or improving quality of care, citing specific and measurable changes observed in these areas. And then throughout the narrative, there were other minor edits made. Next slide, please. So as the discussion around executive compensation at OneCare has continued, I did want to review what we do know about how these salaries are set. UVM Health Network, which handles HR-related functions for OneCare, uses a variety of third-party surveys to determine salary benchmarks, and you can see the 4 listed out. And it has been explained to us that the process includes comparisons to ACO executives wherever data exist. For example, if they're benchmarking OneCare CEO, they have a list here of different titles that they might search for within each one of those surveys. Next slide, please. We also know from the policy that they had provided with us that base salaries are targeted at the 50th percentile of the national peer group. Individual salaries will be administered with ranges with structured midpoints set at the median, and then there's a 50% spread from minimum to maximum. And then also regional data is taken into consideration when placing individuals into their respective ranges. And then when it comes to performance-based variable pay, they are looking at the 65th percentile target when to award when there have been the achievement of strategic and operational objectives. So the total cash compensation for the executives, they aim for the 65th percentile, but it may be below, at, or above, depending on the 3 items listed here: the positioning of an executive salary within the appropriate salary range, the performance of the network and its affiliates, and then other criteria. Next slide, please. So that's what we knew, and the staff had requested some additional information, and OneCare declined to share that information. So on June 28th, the Green Mountain Care Board sent a subpoena directing OneCare to produce all of the following documents relating to compensation benchmarks utilized in connection with establishing and/or targeting compensation for OneCare CEOs, vice presidents, and directors. All documents sufficient to identify the dollar amounts of the 50th percentile for OneCare CEO, VPs, and directors. All documents sufficient to identify the benchmarked percentile for total compensation for OneCare CEO, VPs, and directors, and all documents relating to how the award of variable compensation in 2022 was structured to achieve specific and measurable goals that support the ACO's efforts to reduce cost growth or improve the quality and overall care of enrollees, and decisions to award 100% of available variable compensation for FY22 for all OneCare's executives, including its CEO, vice presidents, and directors. Again, the subpoena is available on our website if you wish to review the language yourself. On July 7th, the Green Mountain Care Board received, thank you, Julia, several documents in response to the subpoena. The submission is available on our website. Most of the submission was duplicative of materials already received from OneCare as part of the certification eligibility verification process. The new information include rolled up compensation data, meaning that it was rolled up into categories rather than by individual salary information. So instead of each vice president position being listed out, it was rolled up into a category of vice presidents. And likewise for the director level, instead of individual director level information, it was as a group, all directors. It did include the dollar amounts of the benchmarked 50th and 65th percentiles, but it lacked explanation of what the benchmark is, how it is determined, and the percentiles at which the actual salaries are set. Next slide, please. On July 11th, the Green Mountain Care Board followed up to OneCare that responsive documents to the subpoena need to include source documents and communication that show exactly what the benchmark is on the 50th and 65th percentile numbers. It needs to include source documents and communications about the selection of the benchmark, the methodology used to develop the benchmark, and the determination of the appropriateness of the benchmark. We're looking for source documents explaining the content of the rolled up chart, meaning attachment A, which should include at least A, by individual position, OneCare executives, their base compensation, variable compensation, 50th and 65th percentile of the benchmark, and actual percentile of individual compensation on the benchmark, and B, documentation sufficient to understand why the rolled up chart doesn't align with the base salary and variable compensation that OneCare provided as part of its revised budget. Also looking for documents and communications related to the discussion of awarding FY22 variable compensation to OneCare executives and the decision to award FY22 variable compensation at 100%. At this time, we have received some documents from OneCare that came in after hours last night, and the staff are working on their analysis. Next slide, please. We did want to walk through some considerations for the board when deciding whether and how to cap executive compensation. These are merely areas for you to ponder on while you make your decision. So the first is the affordability and administrative expenses. By limiting OneCare's administrative expenses, the board prevents these costs from being passed on to Vermonters. As far as compensation as organizational performance incentive, by linking executive compensation to OneCare's organizational performance, such as benchmarking metrics, the Green Mountain Care Board can increase leadership's incentive to improve organizational performance. When it comes to the ability to hire and retain staff, limiting executive compensation to the median for similar positions could affect the ACO's ability to hire highly qualified, experienced candidates. It could also impact staff productivity, morale, and retention, which could result in increased administrative costs related to leadership and staff transitions, as well as an increase in non-wage benefits such as paid time off. And then there's the preservation of hierarchy of pay scale. Focusing on executive positions alone risks upsetting the hierarchy of pay scale. Either subordinates may have higher salaries than their direct supervisors, or salary reductions could trickle down to mid and junior level staff. Just things to think about. Next slide, please. So we would like to present the board with a menu of options for today's potential vote. I'm going to walk through each one. The first option is to publish the FY24 OneCare budget guidance with the proposed changes that we discussed earlier, but remove both budget targets 6 and 7, which are the two targets that cap executive compensation at the 50th percentile and set 40% of the variable compensation being tied to quality and cost performance, respectively. By removing these targets, the board could evaluate what OneCare submits in the fall with that additional context and more information on how 2023 performance has been to date. Like I mentioned earlier, the removal or inclusion of budget targets does not determine the board's authority to modify an ACO's budget. So number 2, similarly, we could publish the guidance with the proposed changes, but with placeholders for budget targets 6 and 7. Essentially, this would allow the board, if you choose to do so, to wait for any additional information before setting budget targets associated with executive compensation. Once the board is more certain with the direction they would like to go, we can add these targets into their guidance before the October 1 submission date. Option number 3 is to publish the guidance with the proposed changes as currently drafted, which we will review on the next slide, what budget targets 6 and 7 look like. And then option number 4, I've mocked up some alternative language that we'll see in a couple of slides that allows some more flexibility in these budget targets as well. So next slide, please. So option number 3 is the one where where you could vote to keep the guidance as it is currently drafted. So budget target currently reads, budget target 6 currently reads, the ACO shall cap the total compensation in FY24 for the ACO's executives, VP VP level and above or director level and above at the 50th percentile of the benchmark used by the ACO to establish its executives' compensation. Budget target 7 currently reads, the ACO must structure the variable compensation of executive compensation, variable portion of executive compensation, so that at least 40% is tied to OneCare's FY24 achievement of specific and measurable goals related to the ACO provider network performance and cost and quality metrics. Quality metrics must align with the ACO clinical focus areas as long as those priorities or focus areas are consistent with the APM quality framework. And at least some of the metrics include areas identified in the March 2023 benchmarking report as needing improvement. That is as drafted. Next slide, we'll look at option 4 with a more flexible language. Budget target 6 says the ACO shall target the base compensation in FY24 for the ACO's executives, VP level and above, or director level and above, at the 50th percentile of the benchmark used by the ACO to establish its executive compensation. Variable compensation shall be targeted at the 65th percentile. OneCare must provide complete justification of any salaries awarded above these targets. And then budget target number 7, the ACO shall structure the variable proportion of executive compensation so that some portion is tied to OneCare's FY24 achievement of specific and measurable goals related to performance in cost and quality metrics. Quality metrics should align with any payer program quality priorities or ACO clinical focus areas as long as those priorities or focus areas are consistent with the APM quality framework. And at least some of the metrics include areas identified in the March 2023 benchmarking report as needing improvement. Next, well, let's go back to back a couple of slides to the 4 options, and I'll hand it back over to you, Chair Foster, for any board discussion.
Sure. And I guess I'll go first with a question, Ms. Sawyer. I didn't pull this up before the meeting. I should have checked it, but there was a letter to us about certain budget targets. I think it was received from OneCare, and they were requesting that we didn't have particular budget targets. Can you remind me which budget targets that was referring to?
I would also have to pull that up to be able to speak to it. If you want to give me a minute to do so, I certainly can.
That's okay. I was looking while you're speaking and I didn't find it. We can come back to that.
Okay.
I guess I would just say for myself, I would support going with option 1 on the list that you have and not including the budget targets as of today for 6 and 7. Other than that, I didn't have any other questions or comments, and I'll turn it over to the other board members.
I can go ahead and jump in. My apologies if there is loud noises in the back, because as I mentioned at the top of the meeting, I have some basement deconstruction happening to get the wet stuff out. I'm certainly fine with with going with option one. I think getting additional information and having some more time to think about it would be helpful for me. I did want to just make a note about in the proposal that I had posted, which Michelle, quite frankly, had a lot of what I would call technical drafting suggestions that Michelle has incorporated. The one substantive piece unrelated to these options is the suggestion to include a plan regarding provider accountability, because I think if what we're looking for is to have improvement in the quality data in particular, that's really the work of the provider network. And so I think ensuring that the accountability is consistent throughout the organization is necessary. Now, I don't know what that should look like, which is why I had suggested a plan. So I just wanted to add in a little note about the rationale for why I suggested that.
I could support option one. I agree with Robin. I think having some further information would be super helpful. I just want to also note, thank you, Michelle. I really felt like the background information as to how the budget targets are viewed by the board and the board's authority in and around the budget and budget targets was very helpful context. But I agree. I think there's a lot of evolving information on this topic, and I think more time to review the information and that we're getting from OneCare and have some strong consideration of the implications of that would be helpful. So I could go with one. That'd be fine.
May I just ask a clarifying question? Because I view one as publishing the guidance with the proposed changes, but not having any targets for 6 and 7 for executive comp at all, and no plan to revisit those targets. I viewed option 2 as publish the guidance with the proposed changes, but allow for a revisitation of budgets targets 6 and 7, which are related to executive comp at a future date when we get the information that we requested through the subpoena. So I just want to understand where the other board members are, because it sounds like folks are aligning around 2, but I hear people saying 1. So I think I'm just a bit confused.
I think you're right, Jess. I didn't quite. Yeah, I think Michelle, what do you mean when you say placeholder? Is it like an actual number, or is it just sort of a blank that we'll fill in when we get the information?
Yeah, Jess has the right idea. By placeholder, I mean when we publish the guidance, there would be budget target number 6, and it would say something to the effect of to be determined and issued by the Green Mountain Care Board at a later date. Just as a stronger signal that there will likely be guidance in these for 6 and 7, just not currently.
I got it. So we could still go back and have nothing, which is number 1, or we could put something in later. Yeah. Okay. All right. So Jess, I'm sorry. I meant number 2.
Okay. In that case, I'm supportive of option number 2 as well, for the reasons outlined from others.
I am as well. I mean, I think 1 and 2 both allow the flexibility to come back and think about it. 1 wouldn't define specific targets, but we could have the discussion. 2 would define the specific targets and have the discussion, which I think could be helpful. So either would be okay with me.
Do we have a sense of the timeline for a revisitation? I suppose it depends on when we get all the information that's been requested from the subpoena. Is there a hard stop timeline when we must make that decision about budget targets 6 and 7?
I don't believe there is a hard and set date. I would ask Russ to chime in if he feels otherwise, but I don't believe there is a hard deadline. However, we know that the next hard deadline is October 2nd for them to submit their budget. So in order for them to take those targets into consideration, we would certainly want to provide those targets as much in advance as we could prior to that date.
Thank you.
And Ms. Sawyer, Ms. Bowles sent around the public comment I had asked about, and it was, refreshed my memory. The letter was relating to the proposed budget targets that were at page 7 of the draft guidance.
Which is all of them. Page 7
Correct.
contains all of them. Okay.
Yeah, right. I have nothing else on my end. If any other board members do, please go ahead. And if not, I think we can move on. See, Ms. Rader-Wallach, you have your hand raised. I'll do the motion language and public comment. HCI, yeah, cool, thanks. Michelle, will you pull up the motion language? All right, before we go to the motion, I will take healthcare advocate and public comment. So Mr. Fisher, I saw you here. Do you have any public comment or any comment?
Yeah, I do. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the board. Let me just do a sound check. Are people hearing me okay? Thank you. Well, we're maybe on a bit of a different page than clearly the majority of the board. We think it's very important to be very clear with any regulated entity about what the rules are. And so I suppose, the questions by member Holmes about sort of timing reflects on this. I think that it's very important, if the board is not going to define exactly what it's looking for here, that the board come back to it in a timely way, so that OneCare, or I'm going to just say it broadly, that OneCare can know how to comply, know what the board is looking for. We stand by our public comment that we submitted on June 26th, which recommended clarifying that positions should be included, what positions should be included in the executive compensation targets, called on the board to determine what benchmark to use. That should be a board decision, and to connect 100% of variable compensation to specific measurable goals rooted in quality improvement in population health. I was on my way to saying that I thought that those were closest to option 3, or that option 3 would be the easiest to adjust to align with what we're calling for here. I suppose option 2 also does, because it gives you an opportunity to come back to it, but we stand by those positions. I think I have articulated, and we have articulated, the reasoning behind those positions well enough in the past, and I'm not going to repeat myself now, other than to say that there may be standards in the healthcare industry that current practices align with, and that it looks normal and commonplace to have these levels of compensation and these and the variable compensation as has been discussed here. But from our vantage point, it's thinking about it from the vantage point of the Vermonter who's trying to get care and trying to pay for their care. It's hard to align these practices with those values of working Vermonters. And so that's what motivates us here. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. And does anyone else from your team have any comment, or just you? Okay, great. I'll turn to public comment. Ms. Rader Wallach, I see your hand is raised. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As all of you know, I've had various roles in Vermont healthcare reform, including working with Robin to write the statute that established this board. And that was in the context of a proposal from a governor to create a single payer system in Vermont, which would not have been a wholly public entity, as in most countries or places where there is a single payer system. It would have involved some sort of public-private partnership, but that did not come to fruition. The Green Mountain Care Board, nonetheless, came into existence and continues to exist, but it doesn't run the healthcare system in Vermont. We do not have a publicly owned healthcare system. We have a privately owned healthcare system that competes in a national healthcare economy for talent. And so when we set compensation in any component, whether it's a small little rural hospital or at the academic medical center at the ACO, we are competing for talent in a national market. And that has been our singularly most challenging aspect of operations as healthcare providers in the last couple of years. How do we attract people, retain people, pay adequate compensation, and still live within the regulatory system that we are kind of uniquely subject to in Vermont? There is no other regulatory scheme like this in the United States. And I fear that this has gone off the rails in terms of losing track of the purpose of the ACO, which is really to organize private healthcare providers to work better together. They're not a government entity, but they're organized for the greater good. And somehow they become the kind of target, as if they're doing something evil. And if you were in any other state, I think you would see that there is nobody else trying to do what OneCare is doing. Obviously, I'm biased because I'm chair of the board and I'm part of the UVM Health Network, but I just think that you've lost track of what the role of the ACO is and the role of the board itself. It's not your role to set compensation for a private, not-for-profit corporation. The Public Utility Commission does not do that for Green Mountain Power or any other electric utility. And you don't set the compensation of the CEO of Blue Cross Blue Shield of Vermont, of United Healthcare, of any other insurer in the business. And for some reason, you're thinking that this is a significant thing. And I would just say, like, above all, this is a distraction from the important work that the ACO should be doing and is trying to do to improve the quality and affordability of healthcare for Vermonters. And to focus on this issue when there's $6.5 billion worth of healthcare expenditure that we could refocus for better health, better outcomes, and lower cost trends is, to me, a really sad thing.
Thank you, Ms. Rader Wallach, for your comment. Sharon Gutwin, I think your hand is raised. Ms. Gutwin, is your hand raised?
Sorry, I just was saying my lip got, I have a fat lip. But I wasn't gonna, I tried to push the mic without the video, but now that you've seen my face, it's all done. You see it. I think that there was a consideration I didn't hear regarding a benefit of capping executive compensation, and that is, I did hear it, there's a potential for decreasing morales and having there be a trickle down of attack of other salaries. But I do know that employees that don't make that level of pay or aren't rewarded for as much of what they do, I think it could do the opposite. I think it could be a motivator as they see potentially OneCare being more in alignment with the mission. I think that the resistance that the ACO is giving to providing information and the delays are something to consider. You know, it's pushing the vote down the road, like kicking the can down the road. It's not the board's fault for having to delay in this, but I think that's just a bad indication of those in leadership of the ACO. And then certainly, yes, maybe we'll lose a few executives in these higher positions, but I see that as an opportunity. It might actually give room for someone who clearly would not be working for the money. I think that what each of the salaries are getting right now is more than plenty for a nonprofit, and a nonprofit in healthcare, where we all really should be putting those we serve above all else. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your thoughts, Ms. Gutwin. Ham Davis, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm really happy to see Anya in the game. Thank you very much. She says that you're off the rails. I don't think you're even in sight of the rails. Here's what you really need OneCare Vermont for. You have to get the financing change from fee-for-service to capitation. You cannot do that without some kind of a gizmo to make it possible. That's what ACOs were designed for in the national Obamacare legislation. That's what they have to do. Now, they can't do it all, and they've been blamed for all of the failures. Here's just a metaphor you might think about. If you want to paint a house, okay, then you really need two things. The first thing you need is scaffolding, okay, scaffolding. But if you just put up the scaffold, the house never gets painted. OneCare is the scaffolding. You need a painter, and that is the Green Mountain Care Board. And all this stuff, I have never seen in 62 years a more crazy blizzard of bureaucratic stuff about do this, do that, and the other thing. If you don't want OneCare, if you don't want an ACO, then say so. And but what you're asking it to do is just simply not possible. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment, Mr. Davis. And I don't see any other hands. So I think, Michelle, we can go to the motion language.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Owen, before you go. Michelle, could you go over again the placeholder language? Yeah, I'm assuming that's where Ellen's going. So I just wanted to be clearer on what that's actually going to say.
Sure. As I have it drafted, it says to be determined and issued by the Green Mountain Care Board prior to budget submission.
What will be determined? Exactly.
The target itself. So the way I have it listed out is budget targets 1 through 5, and then that's what number 6 says in brackets, and number 7 says the same in brackets, and then continuing with 8 and 9, just to maintain the numbers that we've been referring to throughout this entire process, try to keep those stable.
Okay, and can you just go back to the slide 6 and 7 so I can see the full text of 6 and 7? So it will say so in the bracketed part, it will say to be determined, or it'll say at the to be determined. I'm sorry, I just want to make sure I understand what we're voting on.
Sure. Exactly. So it's, budget target 6 in a bracket to be determined and issued by the Green Mountain Care Board prior to budget submission. And the same
so the
for
whole
number 7.
For 7, I see. So you'll take out all of the text of 6 and 7 and just put to be determined.
Exactly.
Okay.
So apologies if I could just jump in. I think for clarity, the text that you're looking at in 6 would be removed and inserted would be a bracket that would say any target or benchmark regarding a cap of total compensation to be determined and added. And then similarly with 7, the text you're looking at would be removed and inserted would be a bracket that says any target or benchmark regarding the structure of the variable portion of executive compensation to be determined and added.
Thank you, Russ.
Yeah, thank you, Russ. Okay. So before you make a motion, I'll just clarify where I'm at. So where I'm at is I'm not ready to cap total compensation. I am in favor of clarifying the existing guidance on variable compensation. So if you make the motion so that we're doing 6 and 7 together, I'm going to vote no. If you break them up, I would vote no on 6 and yes on 7. So breaking it up would allow me to vote for part of the motion if you're going with option 2. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Sorry, can you say that again so I make sure I got it?
Yeah, I can actually, so if the option that folks are thinking about is option 2, where we come back to determine the targets, then if we could vote on each of the budget targets to be determined separately, then I will vote yes on one and no on the other. If you combine them, I will have to vote no on both.
I see. All right. I think for today's purposes, would you want that to be part of today? I mean, I think it would be something that we do when we get the information. We would, I think, probably take them up 6 and 7 separately and vote on them. But for today, it would just be that we're going to look at them when we are ready.
Yes, except that I think for me, I think what the motion would be is that we will for sure be coming back to 6, right? So I would prefer to vote no on that now, just to be clear that I'm not in favor of the cap.
I see.
Even,
but what,
because it indicates that there will be a cap, it's just not determined.
Actually, may I just jump in here? I'm not sure that it does, Robin. I think it indicates that if we want to put any guardrails or specific language around total compensation, it doesn't necessarily have to be a cap. It could be a target. It could allow, I think there's a lot of language that could potentially be put forth for budget target 6 that doesn't necessarily imply it has to be a cap. At least that's the way I interpret it.
That wasn't what I heard Russ and Michelle saying. So that's why it'd be better to have the actual language so that we know what we're voting on.
I think, Russ, if the language were to be if the board chooses to target total compensation, right, instead of cap, could you use the word target? It could be inclusive of a cap, but it's not necessarily the only option there for budget target 6. Would that be okay, Russ?
Well, I think that's a question for the board could vote on, but the placeholder could say bracket any benchmark or target regarding total compensation, total executive compensation to be determined and issued.
And
That's-
regardless, it's a target. It's not a budget order, so it's not capping, right? This is a target that is not actually a cap.
True, but it sets a presumption that the ACO will come in to meet the target or explain why they are not. So in my mind, it's what I would call in legal speak somewhat of a burden shifting a burden shifting type of instruction in the guidance.
So I had interpreted the motion myself as not requiring anything as to these other than that they'll be discussed and decided in the future. Not that it actually is signaling necessarily that there'll be a cap or a target at all, just that that was to be determined. I don't know if I interpreted that wrong, but that's how I was reading it.
Okay, I mean, if that's people's understanding, I'm fine with that.
That's my understanding as
That's my
well. So maybe the
understanding.
language, yeah. So if as long as the legal team can put, if that's all of our understandings, then I think the legal language can support that understanding.
Yeah, I think Member Lund, your concern is you don't want a target or a cap. And so you're concerned that by voting for this, this would lock in a vote that there's going to be some sort of target or cap. And I don't interpret that way. I think there can be discussions, and there should be discussions around no cap or no target or what that should be. That's how I am viewing this.
Okay, yeah,
I
that
guess
sounds
that's
great.
why. I guess that's why I viewed option 1 and option 2 similarly. In that option 1, we would always have the option to go back and give additional targets if needed, and we discussed that as potentially being an option. Where option 2 sort of specifically states that we would go back and purposefully discuss this with the option of having targets out of that discussion. So to me, the option 1 and option 2 aren't hugely different, other than 2 signals a little bit more that we're gonna, and kind of commits us to trying to work that out, which I think is appropriate.
If it's helpful, I can read the placeholder language again as I have it. So for 6, replacing the text with placeholder language that says, any benchmark or target regarding total executive compensation to be determined and issued. And then 7, any benchmark or target regarding structure variable portion of executive compensation to be determined and issued. And I think use of any in that context doesn't commit the board to having one. It says there may be one.
Thank you, Russ.
And Russ, just to clarify, the way you have option 7 written, target 7 written within option 2, are you defining that the only thing that we would be discussing there is the proportion that would be related to specific targets? I'm sorry, I don't have the language in front of me.
Yeah, sorry, Julia, if you could flip back to the, I think it's the next slide. Yeah. So the placeholder language, as I saw it, was any benchmark or target regarding the structure of the variable portion of executive compensation to be determined and issued. And in structure, I think that captures both what's listed here is 40% and then what it's tied to.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, is everyone ready for the motion? Is that? All right. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Mr. McCracken.
Sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt again. I just wanted to clarify that the motion language here, it covers the entirety of the guidance, including the final changes, which are around the targets number 6 and 7, but it's a motion to approve all of the OneCare guidance, which is, as you know, a lot more than just those 2 particular targets. So I was going to make a process suggestion that if the board takes this up as a motion, that there be an option for discussion, public comment, and anything further before the vote, because the scope of it is broader than just the executive compensation portion.
Yeah, that's fine. I understood it was a lot broader, and the focus of it was actually not executive compensation today. But I'm happy to open up public comment on that again. So I'll make the motion and then we can do that. So I move to approve the OneCare fiscal year 24 budget guidance as presented by staff with option number 2 regarding the executive compensation targets.
I will second.
And I'll just note that I omitted the bracketed because I don't think there were additional changes that were made to the guidance writ large. So I'll turn it to public comment as to the motion and the broader guidance beyond the executive compensation, if there is any. Ms. Rader-Walk, I see your hands raised.
I'll just reiterate, this is not a public healthcare system like you might have in the United Kingdom or Canada or any other place that we might hope to be in. This is a private healthcare system run by private organizations largely. And you're trying to regulate one. And I hope you'll pay attention to the implications in a national healthcare economy.
Thank you. And Ms. Gutwin?
Yeah, just quickly, I know that there's other ACOs in our nation, and I know that they're doing better. So I applaud the board for doing due diligence to do whatever they can to make this succeed. The other thing is, I don't like hearing that there's kind of already one vote to never cap when there really is yet to have information to base that vote on. I think as a person, that makes decisions herself, I like to base it, on data and on facts, on history. And it's not like it can't ever change, but right now we're looking at, I think, a pretty challenging situation with the ACO as it is, and executive compensation should be incentivizing success, and it hasn't. So that's all. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. Is there any other board discussion on the motion, or are we prepared to vote? Right. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Aye. And the motion carries. I don't know how to properly thank you, Ms. Sawyer and Mr. McCracken, for all your work on all of this, but thank you. I hope you guys have a great afternoon, and thanks for doing this for us. Just seeing what else we have on the agenda today. It looks like nothing else. So I'll ask if there's any other old business or new business to come before the board. Okay, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved?
Second.
And all in favor?
Aye.
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 Aye. Thank you, and have a good afternoon.